I noticed the problem when I reviewed my dive photos and found a sequence taken from an angle I never shoot from, because it meant I had been facing open water instead of the subject. The timestamp said just after midnight, a window when I'm usually too exhausted to stay focused, yet the framing was steady, patient, almost deliberate. When I asked the expedition lead about it, he didn't ask how it happened, only whether I remembered the rules, all 11 of them, and whether I had followed them without thinking. I told him I didn't remember breaking any, and he looked relieved in a way that felt wrong, like memory itself was part of the risk. I didn't check the last image again, because something about it felt unfinished, as if it was still waiting for me to notice what had stepped closer. I didn't hear it announced like an order, and no one gathered us to underline its importance, but it surfaced during a tired conversation about backups, when someone casually reminded me of Rule 1, never delete a frame, even if you don't remember taking it, and then moved on as if it were obvious. I remember agreeing too quickly, more focused on the cramped table and the smell of damp equipment than the words themselves. At that point, rules felt like bureaucracy layered over common sense, the kind of thing people invent to feel prepared. I had been hired for my eye, not my obedience, and nothing about the sea had taught me to treat photographs like evidence. If I had pushed back, or even asked why, maybe the rest of that night would have unfolded differently. I spent the next hour alone in my cabin, transferring images while the ship leaned slowly through dark water, and the quiet gave me too much room to think. The thumbnails loaded in uneven bursts I blamed on the aging laptop, until I noticed gaps that didn't make sense. My memory of the dive was clean and simple, but the camera roll was crowded with angles I couldn't place. I told myself exhaustion explains more than we admit, especially when routine work blurs together. Still, I felt a hesitation every time my finger hovered near the delete key, like my body was waiting for permission. My mind refused to give. The first frame I couldn't remember was unremarkable, just open water dissolving into grain, yet it held my attention longer than it should have. The composition suggested intent, not accident, and I kept trying to recall the moment I'd chosen to point the lens away from the subject. I imagined a lapse in focus, a distraction, something small and human. What unsettled me wasn't the image itself, but the certainty that if I had taken it, I would remember why. The absence of that memory felt heavier than any mistake I'd made before. I tried reconstructing the dive step by step, replaying the preparation, the descent, the slow work under artificial light, but the timeline refused to line up. Certain moments felt stretched, others collapsed into nothing, and the gaps always circled back to the camera. I had logged everything the way I always do, with neat times and brief notes, yet the notes read like they belonged to someone else. It wasn't panic that crept in then, more like embarrassment, as if I'd failed a test I didn't know I was taking. I convinced myself that reviewing the frames later would clear it up. The next image complicated that plan, because it showed the same empty water but from a slightly adjusted angle, patient and deliberate. My hands don't move that slowly underwater unless I'm tracking something, and that realization made my shoulders tense. I scanned the edges of the frame, expecting to find motion or distortion, but there was nothing obvious to latch onto. The darkness looked thicker there, almost layered, though I knew that was my mind filling space. I closed the laptop and told myself sleep would reset everything. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it brought fragments instead of rest. I woke with the sense that I had been interrupted, not by noise or movement, but by the sudden awareness of being observed. The cabin felt unchanged, yet I reached for the camera instinctively, as if it were something that could explain why my chest felt tight. That reflex bothered me more than the dreams I couldn't fully recall. It suggested that part of me already trusted the device more than my own recollection. By morning, the ship's routines pulled me back into familiar rhythms, and the unease softened into something manageable. I spoke to the expedition lead about storage concerns, careful to frame it as a technical issue rather than a personal one. He listened without interrupting, eyes fixed on a point just past my shoulder, and when I mentioned the extra frames, he didn't ask to see them, He only reminded me to keep everything intact, his tone gentle in a way that discouraged follow-up. I walked away feeling like I'd been reassured and dismissed at the same time. During the next dive, I became hyper-aware of my movements, narrating them silently as if to anchor them in place. I made a point of checking my position, my settings, the subject, anything that would later confirm I had been present. The water felt the same as always, heavy and resistant, yet my focus kept drifting toward the space beyond the lights. Each time I corrected myself, a faint frustration surfaced, like I was missing an important cue. When we resurfaced, relief came too quickly, sharp enough to feel suspicious. Back on board, I reviewed the new images immediately, half expecting them to contradict my careful vigilance. Most of them aligned with my memory, clean and purposeful, and that should have comforted me. Instead, the consistency made the earlier gaps stand out more starkly, like deliberate omissions. I noticed that the questionable frames were always clustered, never isolated, as if they belonged to a sequence my mind had edited out. That pattern felt intentional in a way accidents never do. I started cross-referencing timestamps with dive logs, looking for discrepancies small enough to explain away. The numbers matched, which removed one set of excuses and replaced it with something worse. I couldn't shake the thought that the camera was documenting continuity where my memory fractured. Each time I considered trimming the archive down to what I trusted, my stomach tightened, and I backed off. It wasn't fear of breaking a rule anymore, but fear of losing a reference point I didn't yet understand. Later that evening, I sat with Lena in the common area while she worked on a stubborn valve, and I asked her if she ever kept shots she didn't remember taking. She paused longer than necessary before answering, eyes still on her hands, and said it was better not to decide in the moment. Her voice was calm, but the way she avoided looking at me suggested caution rather than indifference. I didn't press her, because the question suddenly felt intrusive, like asking someone about a scar they hadn't offered to explain. That night, I reviewed the questionable frames again, slower this time, letting my eyes wander instead of searching for meaning. I noticed subtle inconsistencies in spacing, as if the camera had been repositioned between shots without the usual disturbance in the water. It implied steadiness where there should have been drift, control where fatigue should have shown. The realization didn't arrive with dread, but with a dull resignation, like accepting that an instrument was more reliable than the operator. I wondered when I had stopped trusting my own senses enough to argue. I considered the possibility that stress had fractured my memory, that the environment was finally taking its toll. That explanation was tidy and self-contained, which made it tempting. Yet it failed to account for the feeling that the images were waiting for something, not from me, but from time itself. They felt less like records and more like placeholders, moments held open. I shut the laptop again, aware that avoiding a decision was itself a choice. As the hours passed, the ship settled into its nocturnal quiet, and I lay awake listening to my own breathing, trying to anchor myself in the present. I told myself that the rule existed to prevent data loss, nothing more, and that meaning was something I was projecting onto neutral pixels. Even so, I left the camera powered on beside me, lens cap off, as if it might capture something without my involvement. The thought that unsettled me most wasn't what the images showed, but the growing suspicion that my memory was no longer the final authority on what I had lived through. The second rule hit me on the descent, a creeping realization I didn't notice until the current pulled my submersible slightly off course, and I saw the hull just slip out of sight. That's when I remembered Rule 2. Always maintain a visual connection with the vessel, even if it seems unnecessary, and my chest tightened with a combination of disbelief and guilt. At first it seemed overly cautious, almost trivial. After all, my instruments could track orientation and distance far more accurately than my eyes ever could. But as the light from the vessel shrank behind the murk, I felt the weight of isolation more tangibly, a pressure not measured by depth or equipment, but by the small, insistent tug of a human instinct to stay anchored. I told myself it was paranoia, yet my fingers gripped the controls tighter anyway. The water around me was thick and heavy, stretching into a blackness that felt porous, as though it could swallow the submersible whole without warning. I tried to focus on familiar markers, the sway of the suspension cables, the faint glow of deck lights, the patterns of bubbles trailing from our ballast. Yet even these gave me only intermittent reassurance, disappearing and reappearing like memories of a place I had never been. My mind kept asking whether I was imagining the vessel's drift, or whether the current had become stronger than any we had anticipated. The rule felt less like guidance, and more like a lifeline, a tether that could save me from losing myself in a space that did not forgive mistakes. As I moved deeper, the familiar hum of machinery aboard the vessel became intermittent, filtered through layers of water that distorted frequency and direction. Every time I thought I caught a glimpse of a panel or a railing, it was gone the next moment, replaced by shapes that teased recognition but refused certainty. I questioned my judgment constantly, wondering if I had misread the water's motion, or if it had shifted deliberately, carrying the vessel into shadows my instruments could not penetrate. The notion that the rule required more than compliance, but constant active attention became clear, a mental task layered over every mechanical action I attempted. My hands shook slightly, though the submersible remained level. Minutes stretched into what could have been hours, and I began to notice subtle visual distortions, as if the water itself had a memory of previous dives and was replaying fragments I had not yet experienced. Each time I turned the camera to document a luminous jelly or an undulating plant, I had to fight the impulse to glance at the vessel first. My training told me to focus on subjects, to capture every frame efficiently, but Rule 2 reminded me that survival was not the same as documentation. The tension between my professional instinct and the simple human demand of being near the vessel became a constant internal debate, pulling my attention in two opposing directions. The first real warning arrived when I followed a faint glimmer that seemed like a reflection of the vessel's lights, only to find that it belonged to a floating shadow, a shape whose edges dissolved before recognition could take hold. My pulse spiked, not from danger in the traditional sense, but from the realization that I had almost convinced myself the tether of vision was intact when it was not. I tried to stabilize my instruments, recalibrate the sensors, and force my eyes back toward what I knew should have been familiar. For a brief moment, I felt like I had become untethered in a way that no amount of training could correct, and the lesson of Rule 2 rang clearer than ever. Visual contact was as psychological as it was practical. The deeper I moved into the Mariana Trench's shadowed crevices, the more deceptive light became. Reflections bounced, microorganisms glimmered in ways that suggested structure, and my mind struggled to distinguish the vessel from the illusions that populated the water. Every time I glimpsed what could have been a railing or a hull panel, I hesitated, unsure whether it was real or a fabrication of pressure and darkness. The rule was simple in theory, but impossible to ignore in execution. It required vigilance, attention to detail, and the humility to admit that my senses alone were insufficient. I felt a creeping dread, not that I would fail the rule, but that failure might not announce itself until it was far too late. I began to notice the toll it took on decision-making. Every frame I captured, every adjustment I made to lighting or camera angle, carried a secondary, silent task, always checking for the vessel, marking distance with peripheral vision. This dual focus was exhausting and subtly corrupting. I found myself second-guessing movements I had performed instinctively hundreds of times before. The tension manifested in my shoulders, my grip, the almost imperceptible trembling of my hands on the control panel. Rule 2 had started as a guideline, but now it dominated my perception, shaping every choice with a weight I could not shrug off. It was both a literal tether and a mental chain, binding my attention and eroding the boundaries between vigilance and obsession. Hours passed, and I noticed my sense of time bending. Shadows of the vessel elongated or collapsed unpredictably, and I began to doubt whether the intervals between sightings were minutes or something longer. The submersible seemed smaller in relation to the infinite darkness, and my eyes searched desperately for even the faintest glimmer. The need to maintain Rule 2 pulled me into a loop. Glance, document, recalibrate. glance again, never allowing my gaze to linger on the subject without first ensuring the vessel remained within sight. Each repetition added weight, and I sensed that exhaustion was a trap the trench set for those who dared to forget the tether. The water wasn't just pressure, it was an invisible force testing my attention, punishing lapses I could not yet define. By the time I reached what should have been the safe operational depth, fatigue blurred the edges of my consciousness. I caught myself staring too long at a faint outline, convinced it was the hull, only to have it drift away or vanish entirely. Panic was a slow burn, subtle at first, manifesting as a tightening in my chest and a churning in my stomach. I remembered other dives, previous descents, and noticed that the sense of the vessel slipping away had never felt this intimate, this insistent. Rule 2 was no longer advisory. It was a demand, shaping reality in ways I could not yet articulate. I wondered how many images I had taken in perfect frame, while ignoring the one constant that kept me alive, the tether that now seemed to pulse with necessity. The rule only revealed its weight when I realized the soft glow I relied on for the bioluminescent frames had shifted slightly, a shift I hadn't recorded, and that small deviation made the creatures behave differently, almost evasive. I remembered Rule 3, never adjust the lighting without logging the exact settings, muttering it under my breath like a mantra, but my fingers itched to tweak the dials anyway, to chase the perfect contrast. At first I told myself it was about image quality, about maintaining consistency for the research logs, but quickly the deeper truth sank in. The lights themselves demanded respect, and disrespect had consequences that were subtle and cumulative. Shadows warped in ways that confused depth perception, reflections lengthened unnaturally, and I realized the trench could manipulate perception without even trying. I adjusted one beam slightly, just enough to illuminate a drifting specimen, and immediately sensed something was watching, though the sensors reported nothing beyond natural currents. The water thickened with an oppressive presence, a kind of static tension that made my skin crawl even as the instruments confirmed normal conditions. I tried to justify it as psychological strain, as fatigue messing with my attention, but the visual anomalies persisted, subtle but impossible to ignore. Each time I touched the controls, I reminded myself of Rule 3, yet I couldn't stop experimenting, as if some part of me needed to confirm whether the shadows obeyed my intent or had independent will. Minutes felt elastic. A minor shift in intensity created patterns I had never captured before, tendrils of light bending toward unseen corners, illuminating shapes that weren't there in the previous frame. I tried to recalibrate, attempting to return to the settings I believed I had recorded, but the panel seemed unresponsive, the numbers jittering like reflections in disturbed water. Every flick of the dial carried weight, every misrecorded detail amplified the trench's indifference. I realized that the rule was less about the technology and more about discipline, about acknowledging that human oversight could invite something beyond comprehension into our space. By the third dive rotation, I noticed colleagues becoming tense around minor misalignments, catching themselves adjusting without documentation, eyes darting to the vessel or each other for silent permission. I observed, hesitant to intervene, yet aware that the same invisible pressure was pressing on them, shaping their behavior as subtly as it shaped mine. The tension wasn't dramatic, but cumulative, like layers of salt building on exposed skin, impossible to see forming until it begins to itch. The realization made logging each frame, each setting, each tiny adjustment feel like a protective ritual, not a chore. A faint glow flickered along the seabed, distant but synchronized with a slight misalignment in my beam, and I wondered if the creatures below were responding to something beyond light, perhaps to intent, or attention, or my failure to respect Rule 3 properly. I recalibrated obsessively, trying to document everything meticulously, yet the shadows always found new positions, new behaviors, as if the act of logging wasn't enough, as if it required a consciousness I didn't possess. The compulsion to record became almost reflexive, and I began whispering the rule aloud each time I touched a dial, even though no one else could hear me, as if saying it reinforced its authority. By the time the day ended, My mind had worn a fine groove of hyper-awareness, scanning both the live feed and the recorded frames to ensure every lumen was accounted for. Every anomaly, every unexpected shimmer, became a measure of my compliance or failure. I realized that fatigue and isolation made mistakes inevitable, but acknowledgement and logging mitigated consequences, a subtle dance with something unseen. Rule 3 had transformed from guideline to psychological anchor, binding my attention to every flicker, every reflection, every frame, forcing me to respect forces I could not fully name or see. I didn't notice how long I'd been underwater until I saw the chronometer and realized hours had slipped unnoticed. My eyes had dried slightly from constant vigilance, and the submersible's cabin seemed tighter than it should have, as though the light itself contracted around my focus. Every minor adjustment sent a ripple of anxiety through my chest, and I recognized the trench had begun to impose its own rhythm, dictating not just what I saw but how I saw it. I logged everything meticulously, whispering Rule 3 like a litany, because failing it now seemed to invite consequences no human mind could anticipate. Even when surfaced, reviewing the footage revealed subtle inconsistencies in brightness and shadow between frames that should have been identical. I traced the adjustments in the logbook, confirming that nothing had been missed, yet a part of me felt the lights themselves were mocking precision, testing endurance, patience, and attention. The creatures behaved differently in areas I had thought consistent. Movement seemed slightly delayed or anticipatory. It became clear that the rule was not about the machine. It was about the environment, the unseen pressures, and the discipline necessary to survive in a space that punished carelessness in ways cameras could capture, but minds struggled to interpret. The vessel pitched gently under stars, a sense of fragile security returning, yet the last images I captured continued to gnaw at my comprehension. Each frame felt like it had an intention, a memory beyond what I had recorded, and the tension between what I controlled and what remained uncontrollable tightened. I realized that following Rule 3 wasn't simply about the lights, it was about acknowledging a boundary I could see but not fully grasp, and respecting it enough to survive. Even now, the act of logging felt like a tether, a ritual, a quiet acknowledgement that one misstep could extend beyond simple error. The rule first struck me when a flicker of movement appeared along the submersible's outer surface. Something translucent, fluid, and impossibly large, gliding with a patience that made my stomach tighten. I whispered Rule 4, never photograph a creature that approaches the vessel's hull, almost to convince myself. But the compulsion to raise the camera was immediate, insistent. Every instinct in me screamed to capture it. The perfect shot, the once-in-a-lifetime frame. But the caution embedded in the rule made my hands tremble, caught between professional pride and survival instinct. Even in the dim light, I could see its form ripple against the hull, a shape that should have obeyed physics, yet seemed to float in defiance of it. I hesitated, shutter finger hovering, feeling the weight of previous rules pressing against my judgment. The submersible's metallic skin groaned faintly, a subtle reminder that pressure wasn't just a number, it was tangible and responsive. The creature followed every motion, every adjustment I made to the vessel, almost as if it were aware of intent rather than position. I tried to rationalize that the frame would be invaluable to the team, evidence that could change everything, but the memory of what had happened to frames ignored or deleted, whispered against that reasoning. I reminded myself again, internalized, Rule 4, and the knowledge settled in like sediment, heavy and unavoidable. The deeper we descended, the more it mirrored our trajectory, gliding without effort, while the currents tugged at the submersible, as if it were irrelevant. Each pulse of light I dared to emit reflected off the hull, and cast its form into a shimmering outline that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just its size that unsettled me, but the patience, the awareness, the deliberate mimicry of our movements. I found myself imagining what would happen if I breached Rule 4, if I dared to lift the camera, and the possibilities weren't violent or explosive. They were subtle, insidious, and permanent. At one point, Lena's voice came through the comms, calm but tense, asking me if I was seeing what she was seeing. The silence in her question told me more than confirmation ever could. I didn't respond immediately, keeping my eyes on the shape against the hull, because responding might break focus, might break Rule 4, and that was a boundary I could not afford to cross. I recorded the scene mentally, noting every undulation, every reflective flicker, every nuance of its path along the metal skin, storing it where memory alone would have to suffice. The camera remained down, and I felt my pride curdle into something heavier, a dread that whispered of long-term consequences. Time began to bend as the submersible drifted in near silence, the usual hum of machinery suppressed beneath the heavy pressure and the weight of my vigilance. The creature stayed parallel to the hull, never accelerating, never retreating, just there, constant, and I began to understand the purpose of Rule 4 in an almost cellular way. It wasn't about framing or science. It was about control, about knowing which interactions would leave you alive and which would warp your reality beyond recognition. My breathing tightened, my muscles ached from holding posture, and I realized survival in the trench was less about what you could see and more about what you refused to record. Subtle variations in the creature's reflection began to mimic details of the vessel I hadn't noticed. The way a railing warped at a corner, the pitch of a window pane, the distorted outline of the hatch. My mind insisted on cataloging these illusions even as my body enforced the rule, preventing me from lifting the lens. The tension became psychological, a test of will and perception more than skill, and I could feel my rationality bending with every heartbeat. Every instinct to photograph, to document, to prove, fought against the quiet, relentless imperative, follow Rule 4. By the time we prepared to ascend, the figure still clung to the hull, retreating only when the dim external lights grew distant. The relief was tempered by exhaustion and a lingering curiosity I could not extinguish. Even after surfacing, when the water beneath us seemed safe and familiar, I caught my reflection in a monitor and felt the shadow of its presence still there, tracing my movements, reminding me of every step where compliance had saved me from a fate I could not fully imagine. Following Rule 4 had been a decision of patience and denial, and that choice had left a residue that made my skin crawl long after the dive ended. I kept the memory alive, refraining from showing any images or discussing the event with anyone outside the immediate team. Every frame of that dive remained untouched, unaltered, and I noticed a subtle shift in my perception of subsequent dives. Every shadow along the hull drew my gaze first. Every potential approach of a creature felt weighted with the knowledge of what could happen if I failed. The discipline of Rule 4 had expanded beyond its practical guidance, embedding itself into the rhythm of my work, a constant and invisible presence, shaping not only what I did, but how I thought, how I moved, and how I survived in a place where observation itself was a liability. I realized the weight of the rule the moment I leaned over the edge of the vessel to adjust a sensor on a tether, my camera sitting on the railing, just a few feet away, its lens pointing at the infinite black water below. I remembered Rule 5, never leave the camera unattended outside the submersible. Even for a moment, the words echoing like a cautionary whisper in my mind. Yet curiosity tugged at me like a second current. I could not resist. The ocean has a way of exaggerating tiny lapses. A momentary glance or movement can stretch into consequences you don't anticipate until it is too late. I told myself I was careful, that the cable was secure, that nothing could happen in the brief seconds my focus shifted. But the trench doesn't measure seconds like we do. The wind from above barely penetrated the hull, but the water below responded to pressure in ways I could feel through the vibration of the deck. I thought I saw the camera tilt slightly, a subtle shift I could blame on an uneven railing, but it made my stomach knot. Every instinct screamed that even the smallest unattended object could attract attention, or worse, misbehave in a way I couldn't predict. The idea of stepping away, even for a mechanical check, became a mental exercise in anxiety. Each adjustment I made was doubled by a constant awareness of the camera, its presence a tether I had to honor. As the hours stretched and I documented shifting schools of bioluminescent life, the camera's role shifted in my perception. It was no longer just an instrument, it was a sentinel, a proxy observer of a reality I couldn't fully inhabit. When a strange pattern of movement flickered at the edge of visibility, I froze, realizing that leaving it even a second unattended could result in footage that I wouldn't be able to interpret, or worse, I might never see at all. The mental calculus of attention became exhausting, the rule shaping not only actions but perceptions, creating a tension that pulsed with every shadow along the hull. The first real test came when the submersible shuddered slightly from a current, and the camera teetered. My hands darted instinctively, securing it, but the sensation of near loss left a trace of unease that lingered. I thought about how small errors can compound, how the ocean exaggerates carelessness, and I realized Rule 5 was less about the object itself than the discipline of focus it demanded. Leaving it unattended, even momentarily, was not just risky, it was an invitation for reality to bend in ways that would leave memory and record diverging. A subtle, insidious corruption of experience. Later, when the vessel drifted near a trench wall, shadows along the camera's frame created illusions of movement, like something brushing against the metal lens. I resisted the urge to lift it, even as my mind raced with images I might capture. Each pause, each hesitation, reminded me why Rule 5 existed, not to restrict photography, but to enforce a constant, unwavering presence. The submersible's light could not illuminate every angle, and leaving the camera outside meant abandoning a line of sight in a domain where perception alone could not protect you. By the time the night fell fully over the water, the lesson of the rule had deepened. Every adjustment, every rotation of the submersible, every task I performed outside was counterweighted by the necessity of attention. The camera was no longer just a tool, it had become a measure of discipline, a constant reminder that the trench rewarded mindfulness and punished lapses subtly, invisibly. I began to notice micro-tremors in my focus, each time the lens wavered a fraction, and understood that Rule 5 demanded not only caution, but a recalibration of instinct and attention. Even when we surfaced, the mental residue of the rule lingered. I found myself scanning the waterline for any object left unattended, for shadows moving where they shouldn't, for discrepancies between expectation and perception. The camera had become an extension of vigilance, a physical anchor to prevent wandering thoughts from translating into missteps. The awareness carried into sleep, and I imagined its presence hovering in the periphery, an invisible observer, reminding me that discipline wasn't a suggestion, but a condition of survival. Every subsequent dive was colored by the memory of that near lapse. I moved slower, more deliberate, calibrating not only instruments, but intentions, acknowledging that leaving the camera unattended, even briefly, was a breach of a boundary whose consequences were subtle, creeping, and cumulative. Shadows along the hull, ripples in water, reflections from bioluminescent life, all of it felt amplified, as though the trench itself measured attentiveness and responded accordingly. The rule became an internal rhythm, shaping every movement, every decision, every interaction with equipment and environment alike. By the end of that week, I understood that Rule 5 was as much about psychological endurance as it was about equipment. The necessity to never leave the camera unattended had forced me into a heightened state of awareness, blurring the line between observation and obsession. Even as the ocean calmed and the vessel floated in the quiet night, the memory of the near miss lingered like a low vibration under the skin, a reminder that in this world, discipline and survival were inseparable, and that every tool you carry is also a responsibility you cannot delegate. I learned the weight of the rule the moment the submersible's sonar picked up a narrow indentation along the trench wall, a tunnel that beckoned like a secret waiting to be explored. I whispered Rule 6. Never enter a passage or trench that hasn't been pre-mapped, no matter how small it seems. But my curiosity pressed against the words, heavy and insistent. It wasn't a question of bravery. It was the same compulsion that had led me to capture strange frames, to linger on anomalies others might ignore. The tunnel's shadow seemed almost liquid, swallowing light unevenly, and the faint reflection along its ridges suggested life or structure, though I couldn't be certain which. My hands tightened on the controls, caught between instinct and rule, as if hesitation alone might provoke the unknown. The vessel crept closer, guided by a mixture of instruments and intuition, and every metric told me to stay put while the eyes behind the screen encouraged me forward. The sonar painted a rough outline, but distortions in depth and water density made measurements unreliable. What seemed shallow might plummet into oblivion without warning. I remembered other dives, safer corridors, predictable paths, and contrasted them with this tunnel whose walls felt porous and alive. I told myself the rule existed for a reason, a shield against temptation, but each pulse of bioluminescent shimmer drew me closer, a siren disguised as curiosity. I could feel the trench pressing inward psychologically as well as physically. The narrow opening forced a tunnel vision that amplified every shadow, every flicker, every ripple of uncertainty. The urge to navigate it, to chart it, to photograph it, was almost irresistible. Yet the lesson embedded in Rule 6 cautioned patience, observation without intrusion. My training urged caution, my mind screamed for evidence, and my gut whispered survival. Every instinct pulled me in a different direction. I realized the rule was not just about mapped spaces, but about respecting the limits of perception in a world where mistakes vanish into black water. Minutes stretched unnaturally as I hovered near the entrance, instruments humming, lights dimmed, calculating every shift in water pressure. The walls of the trench seemed to shift subtly with each microcurrent, giving the illusion of movement, as if the environment itself were alive, testing my restraint. My heartbeat accelerated each time I imagined what could be inside, creatures adapting, shifting shadows, voids deep enough to erase comprehension. The act of lingering felt like a negotiation with forces I didn't fully understand. The boundary imposed by Rule 6 weighed heavily, a silent line separating observation from calamity. A flicker caught my eye, a reflective surface just beyond the bend that could have been rock, could have been a living organism. I realized the compulsion to enter the trench was a test, a measure of curiosity against discipline. The knowledge of what might exist beyond the unmapped corridor collided with memory of prior mistakes, previous rules, and I felt the weight of cumulative errors pressing on me. The choice to resist, to hover and log rather than descend, became not just adherence to policy, but a mental exercise in self-preservation. Each second of hesitation was a victory over instinct, a quiet compliance that carried more significance than any photograph I could have captured. The longer I hovered, the more the trench seemed to expand and contract around me, light bending unpredictably, shadows lengthening and compressing as though mocking human measurement. My eyes darted constantly, trying to reconcile perception with instruments, each reading a potential lifeline or trap. Rule 6 had begun to feel less like guidance, and more like a lens through which reality bent. The unmapped corridors weren't just dangerous, they were incomprehensible, impossible to quantify, capable of erasing awareness as well as submersibles. The act of not entering, the disciplined withdrawal, became an exercise in controlling not just movement but fear itself. By the time the sunless horizon threatened the vessel with deeper pressure, I realized I hadn't taken a single photo of the corridor, hadn't logged it in any detail, hadn't even allowed the idea to blossom in my mind fully. The restraint felt unnatural, but I could feel it carving patience and awareness into my psyche. The trench seemed to respond to hesitation, not aggression, acknowledging vigilance and punishing impulsiveness with subtle pressure. I understood then that Rule 6 wasn't about denying exploration, it was about recognizing the boundaries where human perception ends and incomprehensible reality begins. The day continued, yet every shadowed crack along the hull reminded me of the narrow trench I had resisted. I felt a low, constant tension, like a thread connecting my attention to the unmapped darkness. Each frame I captured, every adjustment of lights, every turn of the submersible now carried the silent reminder of the rule. There are places humans are not meant to enter, spaces where curiosity can unravel memory and attention with the slightest misstep. I found myself mentally rehearsing escape, recalibrating orientation, and counting microseconds between instrument checks. all unconscious behaviors born from adherence to Rule 6. Even after surfacing, the corridor haunted my thoughts, a shape that existed between memory and imagination. I imagined what would happen if I had entered, not a spectacular disaster, but slow creeping erosion of orientation, memory, perhaps sanity. Rule 6 had protected me, not by forbidding action, but by demanding restraint, by making the absence of interaction a measure of survival. Its effect persisted long after I returned to routine, shaping decisions in ways subtle yet pervasive, reminding me that in the trench, respect for limits is more important than the pursuit of proof, and sometimes the most important work is knowing where not to go. I realized the importance of the rule when the submersible's thermometer ticked up and down in subtle increments that I almost dismissed. A pattern so slight I could have convinced myself it was just noise. I whispered Rule 7. Never ignore the temperature fluctuations recorded by the sensors, no matter how minor they seem, trying to embed it into the muscle memory of my awareness. Yet my curiosity compelled me to watch the graphs, to see if there was a story in the anomalies. At first, the variations appeared trivial, insignificant, but as minutes passed, the water around the hull seemed to thicken, a viscous, almost tactile presence that the instruments confirmed, yet my mind struggled to process. I kept adjusting the cameras, the lights, the sensors, each time noting the shift, feeling the subtle feedback in the submersible's pitch and vibration. The deeper we descended, the more pronounced the changes became, small spikes and dips that seemed to correlate with movements of objects or shadows outside the vessel. At first I thought the sensors were overreacting, the electronics too sensitive to currents or bioluminescent organisms brushing past. But every spike coincided with a sensation of weight, a pressure that wasn't purely mechanical. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the trench has microcurrents that escape detection, or layers of thermal density that create illusions of presence. But ignoring the readings even briefly caused a creeping anxiety that gnawed at my focus. The rule was no longer a guideline. It was an unseen hand steering attention, insisting on vigilance. At one point, a minor spike in temperature coincided with a fleeting glimpse of movement beyond the submersible's lights, something long and serpentine slipping into darkness. My hands froze, instruments humming beneath my fingers, and I felt the tug of instinct. Document it, frame it, capture proof. But Rule 7 held me back, tethering curiosity to observation, reminding me that even minor fluctuations could signal danger beyond comprehension. The vessel's instruments recorded the anomaly, but the reality outside might have been waiting to punish an unobservant operator. My mind spun between analytical reasoning and visceral fear, the rule functioning as both anchor and lens. Hours passed in near silence, with every fluctuation pulling my attention like a subtle, persistent current. The water's temperature seemed to respond to proximity, depth, perhaps even intention. Small changes coincided with minute pressure variations against the hull, creating a feedback loop of perception and environmental data. I noted every rise and fall meticulously, fearing the consequences of neglect, yet the pattern refused to settle. Shadows elongated, the light reflected strangely off surfaces, and the smallest tremors felt amplified. Ignoring them, even for a fraction of a second, would have been catastrophic, though I could not yet define the exact nature of that catastrophe. The vessel's hull began to feel alive in ways that equipment could not measure. Every bump, shift, or pulse of temperature seemed synchronized with movements outside, creatures unseen, or perhaps the trench itself asserting presence. I realized that Rule 7 wasn't about the absolute numbers. It was about attention, focus, and acknowledgement. Even tiny deviations became warnings, not of immediate danger, but of subtle forces bending space, perception, and reaction. I found myself repeatedly glancing at the readouts, whispering the rule to steady both nerves and hands, aware that complacency could allow consequences to accumulate unnoticed. By the third dive rotation, the trench's layers of temperature, pressure, and light had merged into an almost hallucinatory sensory map, with each anomaly marking potential hazards I couldn't see directly. Every spike, however slight, shifted the feel of the water, the vessel's orientation, and my perception of safety. I noticed microcurrents brushing against the hull that seemed tied to readings, each one an argument for discipline, a test of compliance. Ignoring even minor fluctuations was not an option. The subtlety of consequence made it far more dangerous than overt threats. The rule had become a measure of survival, a boundary not easily quantified, but instinctively understood. Even when I surfaced for maintenance, the memory of those small variations remained vivid, echoing in the mind like faint pulses. Every dive afterwards was colored by the knowledge that temperature alone could reveal unseen presences, signal subtle shifts, and alter perception. Instruments became extensions of awareness, and the act of recording, monitoring, and responding to fluctuations became a ritual. Rule 7 had transformed from instruction to necessity, shaping movement, attention, and cognition alike. I could feel the trench's quiet insistence in every charted spike, every deviation, every subtle anomaly that would have been invisible without vigilance. By the end of that rotation, I realized that ignoring minor fluctuations didn't simply risk missing data, it risked inviting consequences that could twist understanding of depth, time, and memory itself. The rule was both protective and insistent, demanding presence and awareness in a place where sensory limits were tested continually. Even small deviations became markers, invisible threads connecting equipment to survival, operator to environment. The trench operated on principles indifferent to human life, and Rule 7 enforced the discipline required to navigate it with some measure of comprehension. Even hours later, reviewing footage and sensor logs, I caught myself tracing patterns and imagining correlations that may or may not exist, testing whether the spikes were organic, environmental, or deliberate. My hands twitched at controls, repositioning lights, or checking instruments obsessively, unable to release attention entirely. The rule had rooted itself in both instinct and reasoning, shaping behavior in subtle, inescapable ways. I understood that the smallest oversight, even one I might dismiss as trivial, could echo far beyond immediate observation, altering the trajectory of both submersible and operator. By the time the vessel rose through mid-depth layers, the pattern of temperature shifts continued to guide my decisions, reinforcing vigilance and cautious observation. Shadows moved differently in response to currents I could now perceive only partially, and the rule imposed a discipline that bordered on compulsion. The lesson of Rule 7 became clear. Survival in this environment depended as much on noticing subtle shifts as on responding to overt danger, and the trench punished those who assumed triviality in the face of precision. It was a quiet insistence, a persistent anchor in a world otherwise designed to erode certainty. The first time the rule truly hit me, I caught a movement in the corner of my eye, a ripple on the viewport that didn't match my own motions. Subtle enough that I almost dismissed it, I whispered Rule 8. Never trust reflections on the viewport. They may not be your own. But the words felt hollow as my pulse quickened, and the black water outside seemed to fold in on itself. At first I tried to rationalize it as fatigue, a trick of light, or the pressure subtly bending the glass. Yet every flicker contradicted logic. The reflection mimicked my own gestures, a fraction late, sometimes leading them, sometimes diverging entirely, as if mocking my expectation that I alone controlled my environment. I recoiled slightly, heart pounding, realizing that adherence to the rule was not a suggestion but a lifeline. The longer I stared, the more the reflections became independent, subtle distortions that seemed to study me as much as I studied them. Every time I raised a hand to adjust the camera or the lighting, the mirrored movement lagged just behind, or bent differently, exaggerating gestures into something uncanny. My rational mind insisted that glass can't behave this way, but experience pressed otherwise. The rule became a mantra in my thoughts, a boundary separating observation from paranoia, as I learned that even minor trust in the mirror could mislead, disorient, and erode awareness. I felt a weight behind the glass, not mechanical or structural, but something intent on making hesitation lethal. I attempted to ignore the anomalies, focusing on instrumentation, the faint hum of machinery, the distant glow of bioluminescence. Yet the viewport always pulled attention back. The reflection's behavior was subtle but insistent, a low, continuous test of awareness. I tried shifting my gaze elsewhere, closing eyes briefly, counting seconds to ground myself, but each time I reopened them, the movement had shifted, framing angles that didn't exist, gestures I hadn't made. Rule 8 had revealed itself as both a shield and a warning. Looking away could be as dangerous as misinterpreting, and vigilance meant constant mental presence. As the submersible hovered near the trench wall, the reflections began to suggest shapes beyond the hull, creatures, currents, or shadows that obeyed no logic I could comprehend. One flicker in particular mimicked my own posture perfectly, then diverged, reaching slightly beyond the space my body occupied. My first instinct was to photograph it, to document it, yet the caution in Rule 8 stopped me. The urge to record was intense, but instinct and experience warned that interaction could invite consequences I would not survive. Shadows in the viewport carried a deceptive authority, and I realized that trusting a reflection was a breach, subtle but dangerous, of the boundaries maintaining sanity. The psychological effect grew slowly. Each reflection, no matter how trivial, was now suspect. I saw slight delays, extra angles, phantom gestures that didn't align with the submersible's controls or my own movements. Every time I shifted position or adjusted a camera, the mirrored image hesitated, stretched, or anticipated, creating a subtle dialogue I could neither interpret nor ignore. Rule 8 became a filter through which I parsed every visual stimulus, a mechanism for prioritizing reality over illusion. Even the faintest flicker carried authority. Compliance was survival, and misreading the mirrored world risked a slip I couldn't correct. By the time I reviewed earlier dives on the monitor, I noticed the same phenomena repeated, reflections moving independently of my recorded position, subtle displacements along the edges of glass, misaligned light patterns that suggested motion outside my field of perception. The rule now felt prophetic rather than instructive, an understanding I carried as both warning and compass. I realized that what the mirror revealed, or pretended to reveal, was a language I did not yet know how to read. Ignoring it or trusting it equally invited misjudgment. Rule 8 had etched itself into every observation, shaping behavior subtly, persistently, inevitably. The deeper the submersible sank into the trench, the more reflections seemed to populate the viewport, some mimicking previous dives, some entirely alien, all insisting on acknowledgement. Even with perfect lighting and careful focus, the glass refused neutrality. The rule enforced a constant dual awareness: monitor instruments, document reality, and simultaneously acknowledge the possibility that the mirrored world was autonomous, responsive, and potentially malicious. I adjusted my approach, slowed movements, and repeated checks, whispering the rule to myself each time I shifted the vessel or operated a camera. By the late hours, fatigue compounded the effect, and I caught myself reacting reflexively to phantom gestures, feeling muscle tension and pulse spikes over movements that were never my own. Every frame of video I had captured now carried the haunting possibility that reflections were encoding events outside my perception, documenting interactions I couldn't control or fully witness. Rule 8 had expanded beyond caution, becoming a lens for interpreting the trench itself, not just as physical space, but as a domain capable of twisting trust, perception, and instinct. The lesson was clear: control the mind as much as the submersible, and never surrender the boundary between reflection and reality. Even after surfacing, the memory lingered. In quiet moments, I found myself scanning reflective surfaces obsessively, unable to fully release awareness. My mind had learned to separate genuine image from deceptive mimic, trained in vigilance that had become second nature. The reflections no longer terrified in the same way. They reminded me of discipline, attention, and the subtle consequences of error. Rule 8 was no longer guidance. It was ingrained, shaping decisions and perception in ways subtle yet persistent, a boundary that enforced respect for what could be manipulated, mirrored, or imagined in the black water beyond. The first time the weight of the rule pressed on me, I caught a fleeting, unnatural glow drifting past the submersible. I whispered Rule 9. Never communicate with the surface or other vessels about what you see until you are certain of its nature, trying to anchor my panic with the words, but the desire to speak was immediate, almost primal. At first, I rationalized that sharing the sighting could provide safety, confirmation, or assistance, but deep down, the rule demanded silence, absolute, deliberate, and patient. Every instinct screamed to announce the anomaly, yet I felt that doing so prematurely would expose more than information. It might invite forces I could neither see nor predict. The glow pulsed softly, moving in patterns that suggested awareness, yet remained far beyond comprehension. I monitored it, instruments humming quietly, analyzing brightness, movement, and proximity, while the calm sat dormant, a silent boundary I was forced to respect. Each second I resisted transmitting made the silence feel heavier, almost like a presence pressing against my chest. The trench seemed aware of restraint, measuring patience, and I realized that Rule 9 wasn't just about discretion, it was about survival. Even the smallest misstep in communication could trigger consequences beyond human understanding, a lesson I internalized as the glow lingered just beyond the lights. Hours passed, and I noticed the tension between curiosity and caution stretching thin. My colleagues, distant yet connected, occasionally checked in for status updates, but I kept my responses minimal, factual, and devoid of interpretation. Every urge to elaborate, to describe, to frame what I was seeing was suppressed, because Rule 9 insisted that reality's comprehension is a luxury, and premature sharing could distort both perception and safety. I found myself rehearsing every phrase mentally, preparing for the moment I could confirm the anomaly, yet knowing that even then, communication might carry unforeseen consequences. The anomaly moved closer, almost brushing the submersible's hull, but I said nothing beyond required operational responses. Shadows stretched and warped along its edges, teasing recognition of form without offering understanding. My eyes flicked between instruments and the glow, comparing patterns to every documented movement in my mind. Rule 9 felt like a tether, pulling me back from the edge of instinctual panic, shaping decisions that could have easily been impulsive. Every moment of silence became a test of discipline, an exercise in controlling reaction, while observing phenomena that seemed to bend the rules of perception itself. Later, a faint pattern of bioluminescence began repeating, echoing shapes I thought I had seen in previous dives, and I fought the urge to call it out to the surface, to colleagues, to anyone who might provide validation or guidance. The rule weighed heavier than ever. Announcing these findings prematurely could invite intervention, analysis, or even disbelief that might compromise safety. I monitored, annotated mentally, and recorded in private logs, every motion and pulse of light carefully noted, resisting the urge to vocalize. Rule 9 had shifted from guideline to command, enforcing a quiet vigilance that both protected and isolated. As the hours stretched into deep night, fatigue and cognitive strain made the temptation to communicate almost unbearable. The anomaly moved in ways increasingly unpredictable, and my instincts to share, to warn, or to seek confirmation were met with resistance, born of survival training and adherence to the rule. Each time I felt my resolve waver, I repeated the words internally, letting them ground me. Do not speak, not yet. The line between observation and interpretation blurred, yet silence became the anchor, the only guarantee that I retained some measure of control over what could not be fully comprehended. By the time I approached the predetermined depth limits, the anomaly had shifted again, flickering at the edge of vision, drawing attention in subtle, insistent ways. I caught myself imagining how quickly panic or curiosity might have escalated had I reported it immediately, how intervention could have introduced hazards I could not anticipate. Rule 9 became a mental shield, forcing discipline, observation, and patience in the face of phenomena that would have otherwise broken composure. I realized that survival depended not just on recognizing danger, but on knowing when to remain silent. Even when I surfaced, the glow lingered in memory, sharper than reality, haunting yet instructive. Reviewing instrument logs, I could see patterns, pulses, and shifts that defied conventional explanation, and the temptation to share, to discuss, to analyze, was intense. Yet the lesson of Rule 9 remained clear. Premature communication risks more than misunderstanding. It risks exposing one's position, perception, and judgment to forces, literal or metaphorical, beyond comprehension. Every observation demanded patience, every reaction measured restraint, and every decision to remain silent became an act of survival. The rule transformed how I approached subsequent dives. Each anomaly, shadow or flicker was observed with deliberate attention, assessed quietly, and only recorded privately until understanding, or at least tolerance, was achieved. I noticed a change in perception. Vigilance was sharpened, instincts moderated, and every action filtered through the mental lens of precaution dictated by Rule 9. I realized that sometimes, silence is the most powerful tool, a protective measure against forces that cannot be named, predicted, or explained, yet must be respected. Even hours later, when the submersible was docked, and the lights of the vessel above reflected off the water, I felt the pull of the rule lingering. My hands hovered over controls, eyes scanning the surface reflexively, and I understood that Rule 9 was more than operational protocol. It was an unspoken boundary, an internalized warning, and a subtle guide for navigating phenomena that could easily overwhelm understanding. Observing, recording, and waiting became an art, a discipline I would carry beyond the trench, shaping both thought and behavior long after the anomaly disappeared from sight. I learned the full weight of the rule the first time I considered accessing an external panel to clean a lens that had fogged slightly from condensation. I whispered Rule 10. Never remove protective seals on the submersible's external panels while submerged, as though saying it aloud might root it in reality. But my hands trembled near the clasps, tempted by the idea that a quick adjustment could improve visibility. At first, I rationalized the action. It was routine maintenance, standard procedure above water, but the trench seemed to thrum with pressure. A subtle resistance I could feel in the fingertips, and the vibrations running along the hull. Even a moment's lapse could turn the water from a medium I could navigate into an instrument of chaos. The metal beneath my gloves felt colder, heavier, somehow alive, as if resisting intrusion. Each seal had been engineered for safety, but now I sensed they were not merely mechanical barriers. They were thresholds, protective boundaries whose violation could invite forces beyond comprehension. I paused, staring at the latch, feeling the tug of curiosity, and realized that the rule existed to enforce not just technical caution, but psychological restraint. The trench seemed to measure intent as acutely as pressure, and every deviation from protocol carried an invisible weight. Rule 10 was no longer a guideline. It was a contract, unspoken but absolute, demanding vigilance even against the most mundane of impulses. I shifted focus, attempting to clean the lens from inside instead, but the temptation to breach the seal lingered, a low, insistent pressure at the back of my mind. Outside, the water was an opaque black canvas, hiding forms I could sense, but not name, and I imagined what might slip through a momentary opening. Each time I glanced at the panel, I felt a pull toward it, as though the trench itself wanted to see whether the rule would be broken. The lesson embedded in Rule 10 wasn't about maintenance or protocol. It was about understanding boundaries, the invisible forces that respond when you test limits. Minutes stretched into an unnerving hour as I hovered near the panel, instruments humming softly, the submersible's lights casting eerie reflections against the viewport. The water outside seemed to react, subtle currents pressing against the hull in ways that shouldn't have been perceptible. I flexed my fingers against the metal, imagining the consequences of lifting the seals even slightly. Small vibrations against the hull made my pulse spike. The trench seemed to register intent and hesitation, making it clear that the rule was protective in a way beyond mere engineering. Rule 10 was a silent guardian, and breaking it could invite immediate or imperceptible hazards. Later, I attempted to focus on navigation and recording, but every glance toward the panel kept pulling my attention back, a constant reminder that restraint itself was a survival mechanism. I noticed micro-fractures in the reflections along the hull, subtle distortions that weren't present before, and felt a chill as if acknowledging them required obedience. The rule had become a lens through which every minor action was evaluated. Adjusting lights, shifting the vessel, even breathing felt measured against its boundary. Compliance was exhausting but essential, each hesitation a reinforcement of discipline necessary to endure the trench's unpredictability. As the dive continued, currents pushed gently against the submersible, and I felt the weight of water pressing like a reminder of Rule 10's importance. Each panel remained sealed, untouched, yet the thought of accessing them constantly tugged at the mind. I realized that the protective barriers were as much psychological as physical. Removing them prematurely might not immediately flood the submersible, but it could unravel focus, control, and perception. The rule enforced patience and awareness, a tether anchoring attention to reality, even as the abyss outside pressed in with subtle, persistent menace. The hours dragged on, the trench folding shadows into shapes that seemed to anticipate the submersible's movements. I kept reminding myself of the rule, grounding the anxiety that rose when small shifts in pressure caused the hull to hum. My gaze flicked constantly toward the sealed panels, every reflection in the viewport a reminder that Rule 10 existed to prevent impulsive interaction with forces I could not comprehend. The lesson had extended beyond safety protocol into instinctive behavior. Restraint, attentiveness, and acknowledgement of limits were now inseparable from survival. Even as we ascended toward shallower layers, I felt the memory of temptation linger, a low pull toward the panels that reminded me how easily rules can be tested in isolation. The vessel's metal glistened under the fading light, reflecting not just surroundings but my own vigilance. The rule had reshaped my perception. No longer were the panels inert, nor the environment neutral. They were part of a system of compliance I could not ignore. Rule 10 had become a measure of mental acuity, shaping decisions, movements, and instinct in ways that ensured even minor oversights could be avoided. By the time the submersible returned to surface operations, the seal and panel had remained untouched, yet their presence continued to demand attention. Every adjustment, every monitoring of instruments, and every reflection in the viewport carried the implicit echo of the rule. Boundaries exist for a reason, and violating them invites consequences not measured in immediate catastrophe, but in the gradual erosion of control and perception. I realized that the trench rewarded those who respected invisible limits, and punished those who underestimated subtle forces beyond comprehension. Even hours later, the memory of those panels remained vivid, a lesson reinforced through both fear and relief. I found myself scanning surfaces, instruments, and reflections with renewed vigilance, an instinct honed by compliance with Rule 10. The rule had transcended its mechanical purpose to shape awareness, decision-making, and behavior, teaching a lesson that extended beyond the dive itself. In this environment, patience, restraint, and acknowledgement of boundaries were as essential as skill, and the smallest lapse could unravel both understanding and survival. I learned the terror of this rule in a way that will never leave me. A dim reflection stretched across the trench wall, elongated and slithering like liquid smoke, and I felt an instinctive tug to move closer, to understand it. I whispered Rule 11. Never follow or approach a shadow that seems alive. It may not exist in your reality. Almost as if saying it aloud could create some protective barrier, but the words trembled in my throat. At first I tried to rationalize it. Currents, light refraction, or perhaps the shadow of another vehicle. But it moved against physics, weaving and pulsing in patterns that defied comprehension. My heart hammered in my chest as I realized that curiosity alone could undo me here in the cold, crushing black of the deep. Every instinct screamed to follow it, to lift the camera, to illuminate the space and expose whatever was hiding. But the lesson of Rule 11 pressed harder than fear. The shadow pulsed in synchronization with the hull's vibrations, sometimes ahead of my actions, sometimes lagging, yet always seeming intentional. I noticed the smallest changes in pressure, the subtle shifts in water density, and wondered if the trench itself was complicit in guiding the shadow, manipulating my perception of it. The urge to interact was overwhelming, a psychic tug on attention and reason, but the rule insisted patience, discipline, and a recognition that some things are not meant to be chased. Hours seemed to stretch as the shadow remained just out of reach, weaving along the trench like it belonged to another plane of existence. I could feel my own reflection in the viewport trembling, distorted by light, yet the shadow's consistency unnerved me far more. I kept repeating the rule internally, whispering it in cadence with every heartbeat. Do not follow, do not approach, do not engage. Each hesitation was amplified, a test of mental endurance, because the shadow seemed aware, responding not to movement, but to intent. I realized then that the rule was less about the physical act of following, and more about controlling the mind in an environment that could twist reality without notice. The deeper we descended, the shadows seemed to multiply, or perhaps my perception fractured. It was impossible to distinguish. For each move I made, a corresponding shift mirrored at the periphery of vision, subtle and teasing. I tried to focus on instruments, lights, and recording, but the pull was constant, hypnotic, a dangerous dance between observation and obsession. The lesson of Rule 11 became clearer. Following even the slightest hint of life in the deep could unravel understanding, warp cognition, and lead to errors that could not be corrected. Each movement of the shadow seemed to test whether I could maintain discipline, to see if curiosity would outweigh survival. At one point, the shadow split, forming shapes that resembled tools, ropes, even a faint outline of a human form, all impossible and yet perceptually convincing. My mind began to doubt everything. The instrument readouts, my own hand movements, the lights, even the position of the submersible. Rule 11 demanded stillness and observation, a conscious refusal to chase the impossible. My pulse raced with every flicker, every reflection, every subtle alteration of light, but I held position, resisting the temptation to illuminate or follow. I realized that the trench, or whatever entity governed perception here, was patient and cunning, punishing impulsivity and rewarding restraint. Time lost meaning as the shadow's patterns became more erratic, as if aware of my refusal to follow, testing my resolve. I noticed microcurrents around the hull, subtle vibrations that didn't match any known physics, and a feeling of being observed that clawed at the edges of comprehension. My fingers hovered over controls, resisting the urge to chase or illuminate, repeating Rule 11 internally, as though it were a tether to reality. The lesson extended beyond survival. It was about sanity, about preserving orientation and memory against a force that could distort them without leaving a trace. Eventually, the shadow withdrew, but the residue remained, like a weight pressing on perception, a persistent tension in the air and water around the submersible. I felt the echo of its presence long after it vanished, a reminder that Rule 11 was absolute. The rule enforced both caution and respect for forces beyond understanding, demanding obedience, not from fear alone, but from recognition of the limits of human perception. Every decision, every movement, was now filtered through this lens, shaping behavior in ways subtle, persistent, and necessary. Even after surfacing, I felt the shadow at the edge of vision and reflections, in peripheral awareness, a constant reminder of discipline and vulnerability. The rule had imprinted itself, not just in actions but in instinct, awareness, and perception. I understood that in the deep ocean, shadows are not always matter, but they are always consequences, interactions that may exist only to test patience, attention, and obedience. Compliance with Rule 11 was survival, and breaking it could erase not only the submersible's safety, but the clarity of memory itself. By the end of the dive rotation, I realized that every rule, especially Rule 11, was a delicate negotiation between perception, restraint, and survival. The shadow had proven that observation alone can be perilous, that interaction may be impossible to reverse, and that some forces are not meant to be chased. The trench had taught through restraint, patience, and fear, embedding lessons in cognition as much as action. My awareness had sharpened, my instincts honed, and my compliance reinforced. In this place, curiosity is deadly if it outweighs discipline. I stopped moving the submersible, letting the black water stretch endlessly beyond the viewport, and felt a final quiet acknowledgement of the lesson. The shadow's presence had left an imprint on memory, not as terror alone, but as a measure of obedience and focus, a warning that some things exist to test limits rather than to be understood. I exhaled tense and exhausted, knowing that no photograph, no recording, and no explanation could fully convey the lesson learned in silence and vigilance. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.